The population of incarcerated youth has decreased about 40% in 20 years, which is wonderful, because the more we can decrease the incarcerated population, the less we have to work with youth who've had that kind of trauma and that experience. There's also been some nice changes in alternatives to incarceration, raising the age of adulthood, where, like in New York, which just happened this past year. At the same time, what you're seeing is that those who remain in that system are some of the most vulnerable youth. So they're more likely to have been in child welfare system, they're more likely to have been abused, they're more likely to be youth of color. And so you're really working with now a population of very vulnerable, even more vulnerable young people, that when they get out of that cycle at 18 or 17 or 16, that it's really hard for them to reintegrate back into society successfully. So in this study, I was working with one other professor, one other former student. Her name's Diane Terry. And it was a long process. We came to start thinking about some of the core questions around young adulthood. And we were thinking that, okay, we have a lot of systems that serve youth, the school system, child welfare, juvenile justice, and a lot of intersections of those systems that are failing certain young people, like the ones I was referring to as the most vulnerable. So oftentimes you get youth who've been pushed out of schools, pushed into the justice system, into the foster care system, and then they emancipate from those systems and don't really have anywhere to go. So our focus in the book was trying to capture the core experience of being a young adult and having to navigate all of the trials and tribulations of young adulthood, while also working toward a lifestyle that was free from law enforcement and free from crime. And so in order to do that, we focused very much on the experiences of the young people themselves, and we tried to situate that experience in the context of Los Angeles County, which has a lot of unique problems, but problems that are probably fairly similar to other large urban areas. So there's some key takeaways from the book. One is that we discovered what it means to desist from crime or achieve an adulthood that's free from law enforcement and free from incarceration is not a linear path. So a lot of the youth were subject to starts and stops, dead ends, challenges to their very survival that were hard for them. And as we followed them over time, we could see that there wasn't one pathway. It wasn't just enroll in school, get a job, and then all of a sudden everything's fine, right? So for example, we would see young people who did enroll in school, but the next time we met with them, they weren't in school because they had to work or because they didn't have the skills, So I think we tend to envision that there's or the public imagination has this vision of okay, so you were incarcerated or you were in foster care and you were a bad kid, and now what you need to do is get an education, get a job. But it's not that simple, So in our book, by humanizing the youth and really telling their stories, I think we're trying to help people understand that it's not a linear pathway. That's one takeaway. Another takeaway is that even though the young people were making different attempts toward removing themselves from situations that were risky or where they could get in trouble, they were still subject to little mistakes. And so, for example, if you're in a situation that's very protected, like college, and you get in trouble for alcohol in your dorm, or, drugs, like you go to campus police, your parents get called, maybe you get an infraction or something, but you're not usually like put in jail. Not typically. For these youth, just the marking of having a criminal record, some of them were known to the police. They felt like little mistakes would often derail them greatly, like not having their license and registration up to date and getting pulled over, things like that. And so we were trying to account for the idea that those little mistakes turned into big hurdles that were unfortunate. The group of young women we recruited for the study, the young women were a little bit younger. They were also, a lot of them had been in foster care or child welfare services. So the young women were a little bit different in terms of population-wise. So there were differences at baseline. But the differences between the young men and women were pretty striking to us. So the young men, it felt that they had a much harder time putting crime in the past. Partly because a lot of their friends were still involved, they had made a lot of money selling drugs, or they were like having trouble getting out of their gangs fully, so there were still some of those ties that were hard to fully break free from. A lot of the young women's background and crimes were like crimes having to do with running away from foster care, or using substances but not selling, things that they were doing as adolescents. So they were more like time-limited criminal behaviors that weren't the major felonies. But nevertheless, they were criminalized. So when they turned 18 and got out, or 19, they weren't lured back into their old ways. Because even if they couldn't run away anymore, and they wouldn't be arrested for running away because they were adults, right? But the young women did have to negotiate a lot of survival strategies. They had it seemed to be less family support to turn to. So just being a young adult, being a young woman on their own, or being a single mother, trying to navigate all of the hurdles of young adulthood, was really characterized by survival on the one hand, and immense, I guess you'd say, resilience and ingenuity, resources, really drawing on people when they needed them, but thinking about they have to do it kind of themselves. Thinking about what we can do for this population. So we're talking about 18 to 25-year-olds who've spent the majority of their adolescence institutionalized or confined. And a lot of these young adults have been kind of further traumatized or scarred by those experiences. And so they come into adulthood with already not only the cumulative risks of their childhoods, which weren't always easy, but also the cumulative risks of being incarcerated. Now, it's not that easy to just walk into adulthood from those experiences. And yet what we offer young adults is often just kind of more monitoring, surveillance, probation services, drug tests. But what they really also need is someone to kind of offer them ongoing support. That can look like a mentor, it can look like in the form of, it could be a friend or family member, it could be a peer, like another formerly incarcerated person, but they definitely need more than a probation officer, and a lot of the youth found those people. Like, it wasn't like they didn't have anyone, but it would be nice it would be really great if probation offices could partner with mentoring organizations. We don't always think about young adults as needing, say, a helping hand or mentoring like youth, but really developmentally, they're still in a process of needing protection, and I think about in the middle class world, like young adults are mostly in college and they're protected by the dorm meal plan and housing, and their parents are still, especially if they're middle upper class, supporting them. These young adults don't have that. And compounded with that, they have the experience of being removed from their friends, family, and communities for a long time. So they have to rebuild their ties. And so I think in order to do that, they do need to be offered more than surveillance. Yeah. And then last, like on a policy level, we've looked at, or the US has put into place some policies for housing, for former foster youth. We kind of extend that to age 21, health insurance, housing. But I think former probation youth also need to be considered a group that could use some extended benefits into young adulthood.